Hello. How's it going? Day one, thumbs up? Good? Excellent? Okay, I'm going to do this. I do this. Sarah says don't do it, but I'm going to do it anyway. She's like, no, don't do it, but I'm going to do it because she doesn't have faith in you, and I do. We're going to do a wave. We're going to start over here, just to like, yay, day one. Okay, ready? Everybody know what a wave is? Okay, over here, let's start. Come on, yes, come on. Hell yeah. Sarah, you guys are awesome. What's that? Wait, let's do it with woohoo. Okay, this is the last time, I promise. We'll start on this side. Ready? Because you'll set the tone. Ready? Woo! It's the little things. It's the little things that make me happy. Thank you for gratifying my desire for silly things. Couple things before we start. My name is David Simpson. I'm the program director here at the Work Center. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm really glad that you're here. Two things. I noticed there's a very healthy number of people on the sign-up sheet for Thursday's reading. That makes me very happy. Good job. Here's to everyone who signed up. And if you haven't signed up, I encourage, who here has read on student night in previous workshops? Do you regret that you did?
I'm so happy I did.
That's the correct answer. Whew, I was taking a risk. Everybody agree with her? Tell me your name again. Susan. Everybody agree with Susan? It was a good experience? If you haven't signed up, I encourage you to do so. It's a great validation of your bravery to get up here and share your creative work that you've been working really hard on all week. You won't be sorry. You'll get a big hug, sort of, metaphorically. That's writer talk. I'm not a writer, but okay, I'll carry on. The other thing, is Fred here? Probably not. We had a request for iced decaf. And after 8 weeks of summer workshops, we have iced decaf. You want to do another wave, I'll bet, right? You want to do another wave for that? Okay. Okay, so sign up, and there's iced decaf. One of our favorite parts of the week are the faculty readings, which I'm going to get to now because you're like, is this guy ever going to stop talking? And tonight we have a wonderful lineup. We have artist Liz Collins. Woo! Woohoo! And writer Deborah Taffa with us here. He's like flew in on the red eye or something last night. The poor thing. She's been traveling for like 6 days to get here. And then, so we're going to hear from Deborah first, and then we're going to hear from Liz. Deborah's going to read from her work, and Liz is going to do a slide presentation. I think Deborah's going to do a slide presentation also. And then we'll do a Q&A with both of them after the reading. Before we start, a little bit of housekeeping. Deborah and Liz will both be signing their books at the back after the event, so be sure to get yours before they run out. There's books by other faculty this week at the back of the room, in addition to in the bookstore between the two halves of the gallery to your right. Terrific little bookstore, it's full of books of former fellows, instructors, and other people with historic connections with the Fine Arts Work Center. So check it out. And while you're doing so, check out our summer exhibition, which is called Edge Condition. It's curated by former fellow Matt Bollinger and features work by about 20 former fellows. It's a wonderful show. If you haven't looked at it, please check it out. And I would like to, shout out time. I'd like to give a shout out, as always, to our friends at East End Books for managing our bookstore. We would be lost without them. Also want to give a shout out to the Arts Foundation of Cape Cod and the Cape Cod 5 Foundation for so generously supporting our summer public programming. We have to applaud because they watch on the live stream. Restrooms are located down the hall on the left-hand side. We have a drinking fountain and water bottle filler. Say that 3 times really fast, or even once. On the right, opposite for the bathrooms, we have assisted listening devices. If that would make your experience more positive, please ask Fatima or Sarah, and they'll hook you up with one of those. And cushions. Look at how many people have cushions. Are they awesome? Should we do a wave? No, I'm just kidding. I'll stop with the waves. They add to the comfort of your experience. So if you don't have one, feel free to jump up and get one. And finally, please do us all the favor and turn your cell phones to silent or off, because you don't want to be that person. So before we, so I'm going to invite one of Deborah's students up to the stage to introduce Deborah. Please welcome Diana Agosta.
Let's see if this is actually going to work. Maybe. So I had a little printing issue, so I'm looking over my computer here. So, good. Okay. Hi, everyone. I wish I was taller. Oh, yeah, okay. We're good now. So last year, when Deborah described a key part of her writing process to us in her memoir workshop, she said that she writes the stories first and then researches to add historical, legal, and other context. That's the heart of her approach, and really the heart of what we do. We share our stories with and for each other, so despite our varied backgrounds, we can understand one another more deeply. I took her workshop last year, and it made such an impact on our group that we've stayed in touch, and several of us are back this year. Tonight, we're going to listen to some of Deborah's stories as she reads an excerpt of her new book, Whiskey Tender. Let me tell you a little bit about what her fellow authors have said about it. Pam Houston said, "In Whiskey Tender, Deborah Taffa examines courageously and compellingly the many forces that made her extraordinary hardworking father, her complicated, beautiful mother, a childhood divided between Quechan, I'm not sure I'm saying that right, Quechan, yes, and Navajo territories, and her own bullheaded, indomitable spirit." Bojan Lewis describes Taffa as a Quechan storyteller, rebel, intellectual, and guiding light through the obfuscated history of the American Southwest. And he says that the book confronts the perpetual machine of the U.S. empire's long desire to exterminate Native nations and continually dishonor treaties and agreements. Tommy Orange said that Whiskey Tender is unexpected and propulsive, indeed tender, but also bold and beautifully told, like a drink you didn't know you were thirsty for. And also, it weaves together a kind of completeness from brokenness and hope, from knowing love and loss and love again. Leslie Jameson says that it's an honoring of heritage and tradition that holds centuries of history while also holding close the searing particulars of daily life, jokes, night terrors, whispered confessions. And Kelly Jo Ford said a meticulously researched and critical look at self and country. Whiskey Tender breaks your heart and then makes it soar. So I think that gives you a hint of what you're going to hear. Throughout her career, Deborah has received fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts in Prose, PEN America, MacDowell, Rona Jaffe, and the New York State Summer Writers Workshop. She received her MFA from the Nonfiction Writing Program at the University of Iowa. A member of the Yuma Nation and Laguna Pueblo, she is the director of the MFA Creative Writing Program at the Institute of American Indian Arts and splits her time between St. Louis, Missouri and Santa Fe, New Mexico. But I'm not a book reviewer or a famous author. I know Deborah as a wonderful teacher. Memoir writing in its many forms is like sharing the hidden parts of ourselves. We feel vulnerable. We doubt ourselves. We wonder, does this sound stupid? Is this close enough to the bone? Are we really writers? Building trust in each other is crucial, and Deborah builds that sense of community from the start. Her approach to the workshop, or to workshops in general, flows from the same well as her writing, with stories and people at the core. She creates such a feeling of curiosity and support that we all feel safe enough to take more chances with our writing. For those of you who don't know her or her work yet, I'm honored to introduce you to Deborah Taffa as she shares an excerpt of her new book, Whiskey Tender.
Such a nice gift to hear that you guys stuck together all year. It makes me really happy. And it's lovely to see Chen munching on his cookie in the audience. Hi. It's good to be back. It didn't take 6 days to get here, but I did have a 6-hour layover yesterday. I don't know. I think one of the things that happens when you're traveling all over and reading a lot is you get a little bit tired of it. So I hope you guys don't mind that I crafted a sort of talk about process, since a lot of you are writing today. So I will read like a little small section from the opening, kind of the beginning of the book, and then something from the end, at the end. But the middle part of my talk will be about craft and process. Thank you for having me again. It's really nice to be back in Provincetown. The East Coast to me always feels like, woo, you hit the big time. You're on the East Coast. I'm a little northern New Mexico girl, so it's not my jam out here for sure. Dad bristled when my Uncle Gene came around, especially if he had been drinking. And as I smelled alcohol on Uncle Gene's breath at the drive-in, Dad suddenly appeared at my side. "Come on, kids," he said, holding a bag of popcorn in his hand. Uncle Gene took a step back and lifted his chin. "Gonna hang out with me and the guys tonight?" A couple of Indians I'd never seen called to Gene from the tailgate of an old truck, but Dad didn't look in their direction. "Nah, man," Dad answered. "Who are you, Mr. Rogers?" Gene asked. Dad snickered. He handed the popcorn to Joan, picked up Monica, and took me by the hand. We sidestepped his brother, who slapped Dad on the shoulder as we headed back to our car to watch the show. I still remember Uncle Gene's thin goatee, combed sharply to a point as we walked away. I always wanted to grab it, but he was scary as he was tall, and even when he picked me up, I was too afraid to touch it. When we got back to the Nova, I took my place on the blanket on the grass and stared up at the sky. The stars were always visible in the desert, and I didn't feel like watching the show. If Dad had a secret, it was here, lodged between him and his brother, and the longer he kept it hidden, the more it began to smell. That night, Dad pulled out his whiskey when we got home from the drive-in. Always watchful when he drank, I felt relieved when he took only a few swigs before falling asleep on the couch. It was hotter than usual that summer, our entire world covered in dust. The Colorado River ran low, and not only because of the dams, though it was monsoon season, the monsoons hadn't come. It was late, and I was sleeping on the carpet in the living room when Dad suddenly kicked over a lamp. He leapt to his feet as it crashed on the ground. I sat up and saw him as he rushed out the front door, a weird shriek coming out of his throat like he was imitating the Apache cicadas in the mesquite tree outside. Mom appeared in an instant, rushing outside to try and tug him back in by the arm. I could see his dim outline in the dark, jerking and shuddering like he was crying. As they stood in the entryway, I heard him say, "I killed a man." He repeated it in a startled voice like it had just happened. Mom hushed him. She led him toward their bedroom in the dark, only the top halves of their bodies appearing above the couch. They floated along like ghosts hacked in two, the horror of my discovery making their appearance grisly. A crack in Dad's mask had busted open, and a little light was shining in. It would be years before I would learn the full story, but witnessing his night terror was a major foray into understanding the river of traumatic events he held in his body. A decade ago, I was just like you guys. I was a beginning writer. I had dreams and I was fumbling around with words, publishing a bit of fiction and poetry while I was studiously ignoring personal essays and memoir. I did not yet call myself a writer, but I was pointing in that direction. I joined a neighborhood writers group. I went to the Iowa Summer Writers Festival. And as a non-traditional undergraduate student in my 30s, I won fellowships 2 summers in a row to study with Philip Lopate, a man we might call the godfather of the personal essay. In the art of the personal essay, Lopate defines the genre. Beginning with Seneca in the 1st century AD, he marches through the centuries, anthologizing essays by various Western authors. He says a nonfiction plot isn't about action. Rather, it consists of the twists and turns of an individual's thought process working itself out. He emphasizes the importance of yes, but, and so what in the text. The conundrum, the thorn in your side, the thing by which you are blinded, the problem about which you must discover the truth. By writing essays, we cast aside our cognitive dissonance and see ourselves more clearly. Who am I, we ask again and again, until we pierce all the Russian dolls inside us and confront our own multiplicity. Lopate is part of my literary lineage. He convinced me ultimately that there's power in creative nonfiction, in proper names, in bearing witness. A nonfiction testimony not only reflects, but may also directly alter history because of the power of the nonfictional characters and their personae to leak out of the written text into the real world. As a teacher, Lopate inspired me to think of an essay as the performance of a single consciousness on the page, an opportunity to communicate who we are to people we've never met. And indeed, if we get it right, we may even be communicating with people yet unborn. I did not come to write creative nonfiction lightly. In my fledgling years as a writer, memoir and the personal essay frightened me. What if I got it wrong? What were my obligations to my family and my tribe? Those old ladies on the reservation are scary, man. What if I was misperceived or mistaken? What if my audience didn't understand what I was trying to communicate? How could I trust my reader? How could I trust myself? How could I be sure that I was seeing things clearly? Where exactly did the truth lie? As you can imagine, I was very excited to spend a week working with Professor Lopate. I had studied his anthology, and I knew how important it was, not only to turn myself into a character, right? We turn ourselves into characters on the page, but to arrange myself as complex and contradictory character, right? A complex and contradictory character. I didn't want to be flat. I wanted to draw from my history, from all the cultural traditions I felt influenced by as a contemporary Native woman and an American citizen, and a dual national married to a man from Milan, Italy, who I'd met in Bali, Indonesia, when I was 20, a woman with biracial children in a family that switched between English and Italian, and with kids who felt as comfortable at the Uffizi as they did at a Pueblo feast day or a powwow. I wanted to transcend cultural scripts, destroy stereotypes, and make room for the many selves I had inside. But how could I reveal myself in my multiplicity? Because my aim had to do with subverting expectations and doing something rich, myself as a chorus, my early drafts used my current self as my persona. So I would begin from the writer at the desk, right? I'm the writer when I'm 8 years old. I'm the writer when I'm 50 years old. A lot of essayists work that way. I had no interest, in other words, in writing a coming of age that just dwelled in my childhood through the age of 18. I told myself that I wanted to write all the Russian nesting dolls inside me I wanted to come across as a contemporary worldly woman. I often teach Lopate's essay on the necessity of turning oneself into a character because it was such a big influence on my thinking when I first started out. And in this essay, he writes, "The problem with the I is not that it is in bad taste, but that the fledgling personal essayists may think they've said or conveyed more than they actually have with that one syllable. In their minds, that I is swarming with background and a lush, sticky past." But it's often not, right? When we start out. How could people see the many parts of me if I didn't give them access? How could I create that access on the page? I wanted to tell everyone everything at once. I wanted to truly communicate who I was with my reader. Leslie Jameson came out to IAIA recently to visit with my students, and she gave the same advice about the multiplicity of the character that you create in the form of several writing prompts. And I'm sharing two of them with you right now. So her first one was, imagine yourself as a guest house with many rooms. Make a list of selves, past and present, who occupy these rooms. Push yourself to create selves that are as different as possible in moods, habits, ways of being and speaking. List as many details as you can about each version of the self you describe. And her second one was, make a list of times you were not yourself. You know how we always say, I wasn't myself that day. She says, because you were yourself in every one of these moments. What if you looked at each moment of unlikeness, each moment of infidelity to the brand of yourself, as a piece of fallen fruit you encountered on the ground? Create a tree, the self, with all the fallen fruit. This type of prompt is very common in creative nonfiction workshops. A prodding toward complex, contradictory, multitudinous characters. And I therefore showed up at Lopate's workshop my second year with something I thought fit the bill. Because it was my second time working with Professor Lopate, and because I knew he respected my ability with language, I wanted to trust him with a more personal, risk-taking story. The essay started in Italy, picking olives on my in-laws' Tuscan farm. It involved a Tuscan neighbor who came over, and they struggled to reconcile who I said I was, where I said I was from, given my ethnically ambiguous appearance. In other words, this guy had a hard time accepting that I was Native American. The story flashed back from there to my childhood, referencing the alcoholism I had seen in my family growing up on the Quetzal-Yuma Indian Reservation. After workshop, Professor Lopate asked me to meet with him one-on-one. And he said, you seem like a very professional, well-spoken woman. Are you sure that you're not playing the race card? Okay, keep your tomatoes holstered if that bothers any of you, because I love Philip, I really do. And I'm actually grateful that we had this encounter. I mean, it hurt, right? But it made me understand a couple of things. First, based on my sort of successful, white-presenting appearance as a woman in my late 30s, he didn't read me as someone who grew up on a violent reservation with a father who had been to prison as a minor, right? And secondly, despite the lack of Native memoirs, which ultimately leads to a lack of middle-class narratives written by Native American people, Lopate wanted to believe that I had had a middle-class upbringing based on my appearance. I suppose he didn't want to believe that all Native people endure alcoholism and poverty. Perhaps he felt that I might be deploying a cultural script to gain pathos, or that I was using a story that wasn't my own because I thought it would be popular. And this may feel insulting or weird, but his assumption that there are many professional Native people, especially in younger generations, who have had far less trauma than I did growing up, was in a way a generosity on his part, right? I could admit that. I hope to read more books written by Native people with middle-class struggles. I really do. But my essay that I had brought to his workshop had been truthful. I had been trying to portray the many personalities and persona I have inside of me in one. And it was painful, you know, to be misunderstood like that. I immediately saw, because of this exchange, all the ways that my life story and narrative do two things. My life story breaks the cultural script, even as in other ways it illustrates common tropes. If I was going to write a memoir that told what happened and told how society pressured my family and me, it would be both surprising and conformative to cultural expectations if it was going to be true. That was inevitable. I still was against the coming of age at that point. The following year, I headed off to Iowa, where I wrote the rough draft of my book with the help of John DeGatta, who's a modern, younger, hipper equivalent of Philip Lopate, in that he too anthologized the essay, and everybody talks about him as being the grandfather of the essay. Only he starts in Sumeria and proceeds through Shoshanagan in China. He includes non-Western writers in the pantheon of great essayists through the centuries. Together, we talked about all this, and we conceived of my book that would incorporate all the Russian dolls I had inside, like I told you, like me from the desk all the way back. And when I graduated, he was like, oh man, this essay collection's ready to go. Don't take too long. Take it out. Send it to a publishing house. But despite the fact that John liked my essay collection, agent after agent said it was too much to contain all these personalities and identities that I hold in my body in a single book. And this is where I learned my final lesson about the simultaneous self I've become, especially in relation to writing. The more singular the identity, the more important it is to follow the prompts and the advice given by Jameson, right? So think about it. If you are like Lopate, a Jewish man born to two Jewish parents, a person who has lived your entire life in Brooklyn, then yes, you must seek the contradictions in your identity. Right? Here you're writing yourself as a divorced man. In the next essay, you're primarily a professor. In the third one, you're a son. In the fourth one, you're a brother. To give your life color, you're dealing with all of these statuses, master identity, minor identities. But if you in this audience are like me, an intersectional writer, right? It's much harder to figure out how to do that without losing the thread. My family looks like the United Nations when we get together, right? My oldest daughter married a native Hawaiian. My son married a woman from Taiwan. My youngest daughter's she's engaged to marry a Jewish guy. You know, it's like we're all over the place. In that case, for a writer like me, or you if you're very intersectional, it's probably imperative to reach out a hand to the reader, letting them immerse in your life one era at a time. My culture is so unknown and specific that there are basics that I have to explain. The more intersectional the identity, the more important it is to build a cohesive through line, a more singular aspect of myself, so that the reader can understand and feel less whiplash. If a writer like me truly wants to communicate, that's supposedly the goal, is to communicate to people who we are, where we've been, what has happened to us. Then we have to slow down. I hope this helps some of you. For me, it was very confusing to figure out, because I would take things to workshop that were all over the place, and everybody was like, who are you? And I would be like, who am I? I have no idea. It was very frightening. This does not mean that we don't deal in complexity, even if you are staying in one era, one time, right? So now I'm edging toward the idea, maybe I will write a coming of age where I just stick with my childhood. But then where would the complexity come from? It doesn't come from your identity or your character or your statuses. It comes from motivations, right? What are the complexities of my motivations in this scene or that scene? I ended up thinking more deeply about conflicting and contradicting behaviors that I had and emotions that I had And I had to look at those things with greater intensity once I decided to stay in one era, and I couldn't jump out of that space. I wanted to see things on a spectrum in myself that were kind of what I would call positive or negative, like I'm illustrating on this chart. Take away who you are at different ages and different times in your life. Force yourself to stick with who you are in just a certain phase, and suddenly you find yourself that you have to sit with the decisions that you made in that time. Rather than spreading, you end up sinking deeper, is what I found. By focusing on a sliver of your life, you find a way of creating complexity aside from an expanding identity, aside from master or minor statuses, where we come from, who we are. We can't escape anymore, so we settle in and examine things more closely once we decide to just be the child. So I settled on the coming-of-age memoir, at least in part, because I realized how uncomfortable it made me. This is really the confession. I think I figured out that I would often jump out of time when I was writing and suddenly be the adult over here. Maybe because I didn't like the simplistic nature of who I was depicted on the page as a child. Maybe I kept wanting to shout from my desk that I was no longer that sad little girl growing up impoverished on the reservation. But in the end, it was a flimsy excuse for not wanting to fully enter the world of my childhood, and I had to bow to the art, which meant that I had to really kind of cleave what I thought was the book in half and set 40,000 words aside and really dig in and expand this. I'm happy that I did it ultimately. Bear with me, I'm almost done. You don't know me. I introduce myself to you. And this is the beauty of nonfiction writing. It is political. It gives me the ability to bear witness, to testify, to set the record straight. There is power in naming. Proper names are untranslatable. For some of you, it might feel weird to think that you're creating a persona for yourself on the page, that art is artifice, that art is arrangement, that you cut out pieces of yourself, and in that way, am I lying if I leave those things out? That's what it takes. You have to shape and arrange who you are for others to see. You cut out parts of yourself that feel central to who you are because they don't fit in that conception of the form that you're creating at that time. It may feel like an untruth because it's a limited view, but truth lies in the smallest decisions, motivations, and details. Don't forget to dig deep. Ultimately, writing from my childhood self reflected a decision to trust my reader. If my personae are nesting dolls, it's the innermost, softest part of me that I have handed over in this first book. Ultimately, I think going to workshop, it became too painful to not be understood. And in the end, I just dug in, and what did I have to be ashamed of? So much of the trauma and ill in my family was caused by U.S. governmental policies. Thus, my struggles growing up, portrayed on the page, are an indictment of the U.S. government and its political greed. If you stay quiet, they will kill you and say you enjoyed it. I paraphrase Zora Neale Hurston. I say to you, be bold or go home. Find your topic. In the end, perhaps a single coherent self is always an illusion. I love this final quote by Elizabeth Hardwick. Looking for the fossilized, for something, persona and places thick and encrusted with final shape. Instead, there are many, many minnows, wildly swimming, trembling, vigilant to escape. Which self are you trying to escape? As I ran from my childhood, it was my first book. What personae do you have inside of you that you must confront to create your best work? Ultimately, gaining distance to think of yourself as a character allows you to find strategies for your past self, right? I don't need to tell a cautionary tale or moralize about who I was when I was 17. I need to remember, what did I think I was doing? I was smart. How did I think I was getting myself out of trouble, no matter how wrong-headed it was? Let me portray my strategies. Let me find love and forgiveness for my past self. Most importantly, gaining distance and empathetic distance from your character gives you the ability to laugh over your past foibles. And I've heard some students say, oh, your book is hard to read. It makes me feel sad. It makes me feel guilty about American history. And I'm like, oh, I did all I could to infuse it with dark humor and to create some levity, because I know it's a heavy lift to read work that is, is dealing in hidden histories. Choose the events for which resolution in your life is nearly impossible, and you won't be able to go wrong. And then with that, I'll just read one little last section that illustrates possibly the idea of rebirth, and I will escape the stage and relax for the rest of the week. It's nearly sunrise on the Navajo reservation, and I'm in a waking dream, in a teepee set up by a Cheyenne Rhode man, a medicine man named Black Bear. I sit in a circle of elders on a night with no moon and listen to a woman sing Wani Wachielo, the sound of the water drum and gourd rattle passing through my body as she prays. An eagle bone whistles as she weeps. On the dirt before us, the road of life, fashioned out of sand to cradle the fire, its flames dancing and leaping alive. The roadman passes another dose of the green cacti we call grandfather peyote. It has been mashed into a relish, its sour taste hard to send down. Trees and cacti are social beings. The earth's plants use electric signals through a fungal network to warn one another of danger. They watch, keep track, and remember. They nourish the stumps of fallen companions for centuries by feeding them a sugar solution through their roots. They nourish and nurse the sick, including me. The fire in the center of the teepee, the water I go out to bring in at 3 a.m., the cedar thrown on the wood embers, the eagle wing used to fan the incense on my body and purify me as I stand before my community. This ceremony links me to this continent, the plants, animals, and ancestors who came before me. It enables me to release pain, over 20 years of collected trauma. I see the earth breathing. I see the sunrise and the flames on the floor before me. I see my face on the earth and feel her inhalation, her belly swelling in time with mine. This cactus, this hero's dose, this living relative, this health restorer, this omniscient spirit. The night following the ceremony, I dream. In my sleep, I ascend a mountain. The sky is black. There is a hogan and a barrel of water. A man with coal eyes, all pupils, no white in his gaze, approaches me. He is Grandfather Peyote, and when he hugs me, he squeezes me so hard I can't breathe. He forces an exhalation so complete that when I inhale, I become something new. Thank you.
Can we have another big round of applause for Deborah Taffa? Beautiful stuff. Thank you so much for Next, I'm going to welcome one of Liz Collins' students to the stage to introduce Liz. Can I please get a big round of applause for John Bartlett? Come on up.
Yeah, I think that's good. Thank you. Hi, everybody. It gives me true and great privilege tonight to introduce my friend Liz Collins. And I'm going to read a little bit of her bio, but then give a little bit more of a personal anecdote. Liz Collins is a queer feminist, New York-based artist, an incredible artist, who works fluidly between art and design, with an emphasis and expertise in textile media. Liz's visual vocabulary is one of geometric abstraction, vibrant colors, and unexpected material contrasts. And over the past 3 decades, her works and projects have manifested in diverse yet interconnected ways that embrace both slow handmaking processes alongside fast industrial weaving. Between collaborating with design brands on collections of functional textiles, like this year she worked with Sunbrella, which was showcased at the Milan Design Week, to producing large-scale public artworks, like the incredible 2 pieces featured in this year's Venice Biennale, Liz has emerged as one of the most exciting artists on the international scene. Liz recently presented a solo show at the Candace Mady Gallery in New York City, and will have a mid-century retrospective coming next year at the Rhode Island School of Design Museum, where she is an alum and also was a professor. So I've known Liz for about 20 years, and we both met in the world of fashion design. And I immediately was drawn to her because she had this incredible understanding of knitwear. She was a knitwear specialist, and knitwear is a very complicated and interesting approach to design that very few people understand. And Liz, and especially Americans, we're not taught this in fashion school in the way that Europeans are. And Liz brought this incredible knowledge of knitwear to the table, and we actually collaborated on a collection about 20 years ago, which was very, very exciting. And to be able to collaborate with somebody who really understands knitwear, which is such a strange and always very fluid medium. We also did a very funny kind of stint with QVC, which was really kooky and bizarre, and but also, you know, paid some bills for us. And but what has given me the most pleasure to watch, and I think a lot of your fashion designer colleagues, is to watch this transformation from somebody who started off in a way in fashion and created a name for herself in the fashion field, but to become this incredible artist who has taken the idea of materiality and fibers and knitwear and has created a very unique language that has transformed and transcended, I think, what a lot of us consider to be sort of fiber art and materiality. And what has been so exciting on a personal note is just to watch, really in the last few years, this really incredible ascension into the world of art, and especially in a very almost non-traditional medium. And to read the article about Liz in the New York Times this spring, it just made me so proud. And so when I saw that she was teaching this course in P-Town this summer, I was so excited to be able to take this course. And so today, the course is Trash Lab, Trash Textiles, and it's basically this immersion into upcycling. And today we went to the Center for Coastal Studies here in P-Town. And so what was cool was that Liz not only introduced us and is inspiring us with the idea of making, but we also had this incredible immersion and education into the world of what's going on with our oceans. And it was a very sobering morning, just dealing with the ideas of what man-made materials like plastic are doing to the oceans and to the beautiful sentient beings that live there. And so with that sort of introduction into what the Center for Coastal Studies is doing, which is an amazing place if anybody wants to visit, it's really a very exciting place to visit. We were then offered to sort of scavenge through what has been collected from the beaches, and we brought that back to the studio today, and then we're going to start to create work, to create art. And it's going to be a really wonderful, wonderful week. And so just with that, I really am so excited to see more of what Liz has to say tonight. And Liz, again, it has been so exciting to watch I can't think of the right word, but just to watch how you have evolved from designer to artist to really this person who has created your own language. And I think everyone's going to be really blown away by your work. So please welcome Liz Collins.
I'm just reeling from Deborah's presentation, and then that, John. Thank you. Thank you, John. Thank you, Fine Art Work Center, for having me here, for welcoming me so beautifully, for Deborah, for all of the things you just shared. In general, I'm kind of perpetually in awe of writers. I always say, like, my ideal partner would be a writer, and I love reading. I love stories. I've been an avid reader all my life. I'm just in awe of what all of you in the room do with the written word, and it's really amazing to hear about your process, to hear a kind of window into that kind of work, because I'm in another world, although I do have to use writing. As artists have to use a lot of writing, which is hard. It's hard to shift gears. I'm such a maker. Nonetheless, here we are. And yes, thank you, John, for mentioning the Center for Coastal Studies. I think we're going to have a good week. It's a very experimental class. And Deborah said something that I want to re-say about bowing to the art. That really feels like my life, sometimes to my detriment, because I spend all my money making art. Everything I make goes back into making the work, and some of what I'm going to show you is very stupendous work, but I'm a realist, and I like to share that some of this fabrication is very costly. I'm very interested in fabricating with other entities as much as I'm interested in hand making. So it's a constant kind of balancing act. This is my only job, but the work that I do in design really helps sustain my work as an independent artist. And there's a feedback loop happening. So what I've decided to do for this evening, because you know, I was talking earlier today. Sometimes it's nice to have a break from talking. I have a beautiful video that was produced in the spring by the National Gallery of Art. There's a show traveling around. The next place it's going is to the National Gallery of Art in Ottawa, Canada, and I actually have one of the people taking my workshop was working on that show. It's a show called Woven Histories, Textiles and Modern Abstraction, curated by the wonderful Lynn Cook. And the book that was mentioned earlier that is my book is actually not my book. The book that's here that I have work in is the catalog for that show, which is an incredible show. It started at LACMA, then it just closed at the National Gallery. It's going next to Canada, and then after that, next spring, it will be in MoMA in a kind of edited version. Every time the show travels, it morphs a little bit. But the video that the National Gallery created is just, it says so much, and I don't know how many people in this room have seen it. Definitely no one's seen it on a large screen, so it's about 8 minutes long, and then after it plays, I'll circle back and talk some more. And then we'll do our Q&A. When I was younger, I was so hungry for some kind of spiritual life. And right under my fingertips, I was creating it for myself with my work. Making art, it became a kind of haven for me. I mean, it was really my mom who I saw making things. She did make clothes, and she taught me how to use a sewing machine when I was 9. When you learn to sew, you're engaging with fabric in such a direct way and really looking at it and thinking about it and learning about the material qualities. Those kinds of things were really integral to my evolution as a creative person. And then Knitting Nation was a project I started in 2005, And it was during the Iraq War, and so I came up with this whole idea of making like a kind of knitting army with people in uniforms to make something collectively that I wouldn't be able to make on my own. I love that idea of collective labor, and we made a giant abstraction of American flag that went onto the ground. That project was so exciting because it was something that allowed me to do a commentary on patriotism, kind of ask questions about what the labor of making fabric is, to show the kind of toil of the labor. Also was really interested in the kind of dance that bodies do with machines to become kind of machines. At the other end of the spectrum in terms of slow to fast is these different methods that focus on automated digital weaving technology, where the image and the form is embedded into the material, and that's very exciting to me. I love that this technology can create this exquisite visual material experience in collaboration with humans. So after the fabric is finished being made, I get it back and I often deconstruct it. The design of the fabric is meant to have these threads that are called floats so that I can go in and cut them away in this manner. So it's all very intentional, chaos and order. That's one of the dualities that I'm really interested in persistently. Having this very refined and detailed and meticulous process destabilized by this destruction and chaos. It's like cutting hair where you say like, well, once you cut it off, you can't glue it back on. It's some kind of commitment, like there's this risk involved in these decisions. I think I was scared of abstraction as a young person. But as I started working in fiber, that shifted me into abstraction. There's pattern and repetition and modular pattern everywhere. I really feel sometimes like I am some kind of conduit of information from things that are very abstract and emotional to very concrete, I mean literally concrete, you know, like a staircase. Those moments, I'm in a kind of deep flow that's tapped into my spiritual being. In my newest work, symbols are emerging. And that is tied partly to my exploration of my spiritual life and connected to tarot and the solar system and to the universe and black holes. The collapse of the environment and the chaos and the lightning, volcano eruptions, maybe is scary, but is also like unstoppable. I think I'm exploring my emotional terrain in a bigger way that is connected to nature and the universe. Maybe even fear. I think about that a lot now, like in terms of queer life and queer existence and how so many things have happened to make queer people integrated and not persecuted, but it's just a promise. There's something connected to the landscape for me about that and things that are far away and perspective and distance. And I think of some of my new work as this idea about the promised land that's always out of reach. Maybe it's something I'm tying into something that is like part of the collective unconscious but I'm also conjuring up these things as some kind of celebration and exploration that maybe is sinister, but on the other hand, it's extraordinary. Like, it's very ordinary to see a lightning bolt in the sky. We've all seen that. On the other hand, every time it happens, it's extraordinary. That experience of, I can't believe what I'm looking at right now, that is awe and wonder. And I'm very interested in that. And my work, to me, feels like a manifestation of that. I'm making it for myself, but I'm also conjuring up these things so that others can have that too. So there's their hit of awe and wonder. I hope that's one of my offerings as a creative person. And maybe that's a moment of escape that I'm creating for a person, or a moment to feel good in an otherwise terrible day.
Thank you.
It's always fun to watch a movie, right? I love watching movies. We actually have here in the audience someone who curated one of the shows that featured my Knitting Nation. Hi, Helen. So next, just to move along, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Venice Biennale and my work in that show. The video did a really good job explaining kind of where I'm at now with my imagery, and a lot of people who know my work are really surprised and kind of excited about my evolution into some figuration and even photographic images. The mountain range here was something it was a stock image from the internet of the Grand Tetons, because I wanted to use an image of my own from my trips to Colorado and, my own photography of mountains. But for this weaving process, you really need high resolution. So I didn't have any massive expanses of mountain like this in my photo library. So at any rate, to me, the figuration it's new, but it's very old, because as I mentioned in the video, when I was young, I was scared of abstraction. I was also scared of painting. I drew and painted a lot as a kid. I loved drawing. I still do. But there was a lot of drawing from life and drawing from observation and, photography also. And so I love the premise of Lynn Cook's show in that it really made me think about abstraction and how I got to it and how I was kind of couldn't avoid it with weaving in a certain regard. But this type of weaving, which I have now embraced that it is a tapestry. It's like a contemporary version of a tapestry, because tapestry is a word that's thrown around a lot. Tapestry is really a technique that goes back to medieval times about how to make a particular kind of woven cloth with imagery, usually, or some kind of figurations. But this kind of weaving is different because every weft that's going across in the weaving process goes from side to side, which is a very different process. But so many people use this type of technology to make woven art fabrics and, big tapestries that now I've embraced it. This is the contemporary tapestry language that we all are starting to get very familiar with. So these two pieces, I did not make them initially for the Venice Biennale. It was one of those beautiful serendipitous timing things where I wanted to go to Holland and work at this textile lab. I had wanted to go there for years because, different than the other places I work to produce my woven artworks, it is devoted to artists and designers like 24/7, where you pay somebody to be with you all day, every day, to make your work. The other places I've worked with over the years have been people I've met through isn't flat imagery. So despite the pictorial result of this process, within the construction of this fabric, which, you know, you really have to see in person to fully embrace the variations and the kind of transparency and really what's going on. And even somewhat like over time at the Biennale, the fabric gravity has pulled down on this black area, and so it's creating this little bubble over the edge of the mountain, which is really interesting. It wasn't like that at first. But within this fabric, there's still tons of layers. It's not just a flat image. There's a lot of richness inside it. And for me, that's part of the work, to have this visual experience, like I said, that inspires some kind of awe and wonder. Like, I'm not really sure what's going on here, but I'm amazed by it and excited by it. This is an image of the loom that I used to make this piece. The no photo thing is, I'm not breaking rules. This lab is part of a museum. So if you go to this lab, you also get to go around this incredible museum, because the textile lab, the facility, is on the site of an old textile mill. So there's still a bunch of the machines, and there's even a part of it where there's these old linen looms that make damask fabric, and they still operate them even though they're like 200 years old. So let's see where we're... So this is to give you an idea of the process and the scale, even though the video did this. And you can see here, the museum situation. So the people who come there to work are, you know, there's this kind of constant distraction that's happening when the visitors are coming around. But I'm kind of used to that kind of work, because I did a residency at the Museum of Arts and Design many years ago, where people just come into your studio all day, every day. It's like, you know, community engagement, which is a huge part of my work as well, that I'm not talking about in this presentation, but it's a huge facet of what I do when I make installations, where I'm building social space, and it's often in some kind of queer context or theme, where I'm hoping to create spaces that stimulate and inspire, but also create some kind of place for gathering and comfort and connection, often in institutions like in museums. And lastly, I wanted to show you just some images from my most recent exhibition that just closed, because on view here, and this is the gallery website, on view here, you see that nothing is deconstructed, and I didn't realize this until after, but you can see it's kind of the opposite. Everything is very heavily constructed and fairly pictorial. So this is a moment of evolution for me that I'm really excited about. And I'm really happy to share it with you. So this piece is the preliminary piece that I made to test out this image and start producing something. And then the ones, and so we stretched it, and the ones in the Biennale were made afterwards to specs of the site. So with weaving, with this kind of weaving, you have a digital file. So printmakers, you'll understand this immediately. It's like you can take one plate and print it in like hundreds of different iterations. So that's what happens with this kind of digital weaving. And then, just to end it, what I'm showing you here, these are the needle points. So this is the thing that keeps my hands in material every day. So at the one end of the spectrum is all of this making that happens in other countries on big machines, that I'm doing a lot of emails and visiting and making some decisions, but not hand making the work. And as someone who loves to have her hands in material, it's important for me to do that kind of work every day. So I have this practice that's very improvisational. I don't plan these in advance. I just start stitching on blank canvas. Sometimes I have to draw lines in, but none of it is planned. So that keeps me kind of engaged in this very slow stitch by stitch work. I think that's good. Thank you so much.
I think that's good is probably a little bit of an understatement. Can we another round of applause for Liz Collins? So fascinating. Deborah, you want to come back on up? We'll do a quick little Q&A.
This is about to fall down. I guess I'll take it. Yeah. Do I turn it on? Hi.
So savvy.
Tech savvy. Have to be these days.
Okay, so we're going to do a brief Q&A, and if you have a question, please wait for Fatima to come to you with a microphone so that everyone can hear your question. Does anybody have a question for either of our presenters this evening? Don't be shy. Well, you can be shy. Thank you. You always get involved.
See, I'm always the first one out of the gate. I feel so self-conscious. But Liz, I grew up in a textile town, and as you probably know, New England, in particular Massachusetts, was the textile capital of the world. And of course, I'm a generation at the tail end of that, as we switched to synthetics. But growing up, I remember that every household in my city, there was a sewing machine. And that meant that that was active, and that there were multiple fabric stores, amazing fabric stores. So whether you were an artist or not, it was around, it was brought into the home. I even remember my great aunts, when they would leave the mill, they would tie shards of wool around their shoes and tell the foreman that was so that they couldn't slip on the ice going out. But what they would do is they would take those wool shards, save them all winter, and then weave these braided, incredible rugs that it seemed like every household had. And looking back at it now, they were the artists, and they were making these incredible patterns. But my observation or question is, and so there's that, we lived that stuff. And when you said that you learned sewing from your mother, it kind of brought that back to me. So with that piece gone, though, do you see young folks coming into your classroom with that desire, or is that vacant? I mean, when I walk into these stores, Primark and H&M clothing, which is disposable clothing. Growing up, we never threw anything out. My older brother's jacket became my brother with a little tinkering on it, and or blouses and things like that. Do you see a resurgence, hopefully?
Oh, where to start with that? There's so much to talk about with that, and actually John, who introduced me, I'm sure has a wealth of things to say about the fashion industry as well. I'm not working with many students these days. This workshop is the only thing I'm teaching this year, so I'm not in the universities, so I have less information about what the kids are doing. I think here and there are younger generations involved in industrial and hand production in industry. I had a really interesting experience recently in Venice because I went back a couple weeks ago with my family to see the show, and I visited this place called Tessitura Bevilacqua, which is an old velvet weaving factory in Venice. And in Venice, they have like a small operation with these very old looms, like I mentioned, are in Holland. There are a lot of places that have these old machines that still work, and they still use them. And they make very expensive custom fabrics. They also now have mills outside of Venice, you know, that do the machine production. But what I noticed that was exciting to me was that all the weavers who were at the looms hand weaving were young. They were young Italian women. I mean, it was really wonderful to see because that is the issue. Like, where's the labor? If the labor, like, if people don't learn to do that kind of work in school, or they're not, I mean, apprenticing doesn't happen like it used to. There are all these reasons why young people are going to other places to do their work or other careers, but that was an interesting thing to see. So that gave me some kind of excitement that something was happening with the youth, at least in Venice. Yeah. I could spend like 2 hours answering that question, so. Anyone
Hi.
else have
Yeah.
a question?
I have the mic. So the previous speaker made me think about and seeing you do the deconstruction, and I thought about the current fashion in jeans. What could be more deconstruction of fabric and expression and really seeing? It's interesting because when you first see it, you say, like, what's this all about? The jeans are all torn up and cut up. But the other way to look at it is you actually see the fabric and the texture of the denim in a way that you would never see it otherwise.
Yes, it's true. I love deconstructed denim. I mean, I grew up in the 80s, so there was a lot of, like, decay and like the whole punk and new wave and everything kind of falling apart, and so it comes, and those trends kind of recycle themselves, right? So it's good. I love what's happening now with the deconstructed denim and other fabrics, where people have figured out how to scale it, meaning to do it on a kind of larger scale quantity with machines and by hand. I mean, the implications of that are complicated and not always good, so that's a whole other conversation as well about labor and the global supply chain. That something, if anyone wants to chat with me about that kind of stuff, I'm up in Studio 7-8 for the week. Yeah, thanks.
I have a question for Deborah. When you're working on your memoir and you're in draft version, you're thinking about how personal it is with people who are still alive that are in your family. How do you, at what point are you sharing it with them and getting that feedback and using that as part of your creative process? Or do you wait till it's published on the shelf and then you let them see it?
Yeah, I don't try to force a lot of crap on people. No, I'm just kidding. It seems like when it's in the earlier portions of the process, it's very fragmented. And, I loved what you said about it being a spiritual practice for you. I mean, like on the Navajo reservation, we still have a lot of young weavers. And I'm always jealous of people that have a way to keep their hands busy. Because when my mind is busy, it's really hard to figure out how to get things straight. So I defaulted by doing one time, one event, one day, and just kind of letting it sit until I collected a lot of them. And I didn't know what the connective tissue was. And really, that's what your family's going to look for when they read it, is like, what meaning are you making of this? What sort of wisdom are you dropping? Or what is the aboutness in this? So for me to hand my father something or my sister something that is just like a scene, and it's just kind of capturing the moment, it's like a nice little anecdote, but it doesn't really have that arrival that is that sort of introspective discovery, maybe, that I waited until it got to a point where it started to resist. I couldn't resist the urge to start sending it out because I knew it was good. And then at that point, I started maybe to show it here or there. I don't know. I kind of feel like just keep your work private for as long as you can. What is the rush? There is really no rush. It means a lot to kind of get it on the page to begin with, and give it time. Just give it time. Give it time. I don't know. I never did this really to create a career. I always did it to create a life. I had to figure things out. And my oldest sister called my dad after the book was published, and she was mad about something. And he was like, I don't want to listen to it. I don't want to hear it. I think that she did a very truthful rendering of our family. She got us. She did great. It was wonderful. And so he saved me probably from a black eye or something, because Joan is a tough chick. She's kind of mean. So I would just say to keep it private as long as you can. Your memories are going to differ from your siblings' memories anyway. Yeah.
This sort of builds on the last question. When you begin writing, when you sit down to recount on the page a story that happened to you, do you know the narrative arc? Do you know where you're going to end up, or is it sort of a process of discovery as you're writing?
Yeah, definitely. I think we bring a default lens to our life. We have a standard way of telling our story that involves a lot of blind spots. And the reward of writing is that you get to see beneath that default perspective. So you write it, you let it sit, you go back, and you discover all the ways in which you're lying to yourself. You get a little deeper. You start to see a pattern develop. You're like, oh my God, I didn't know that about myself, or about my mother, or about whatever, you know. And then you are forced to face aspects of yourself that you couldn't admit to having, you couldn't see before. It's like an embarrassing longing or a contradiction in self that feels like you would want to hide it. If you had told me that some of the scenes in this book were going to be read nationwide when I was young, I would have been like, hell no, I wouldn't even tell that story to like one of my friends, you know? But the truth is that you sit with it for so long, and this is the advantage to keeping it personal, that the lines become so beautiful and so important in and of themselves. You bow to the art. You see that the scene is really wonderful. And then you don't anymore feel like you have a very detached empathy for the person that was the character that you were back then. I don't know how to explain it. It's the art takes much longer to create than it did to live the moment. So you basically remember the creation of the art more than you do the experience itself. You take a moment of a car accident that was very painful, and suddenly it's a page of beautiful prose, and you've replaced it in some way with an object that is outside of yourself. I forget even what your question was by now. I'm sorry.
Can I say something? I'm in a trance. I mean, I want to take your class. It's such deep work. Yeah, it's really beautiful, so it's great to hear you.
I'm thrilled that you went to the biennial. A lot of people from the IAIA were there.
Yes,
because
that is
Jeffrey
true.
Gibson.
Yep.
So we have a huge art movement going on in Santa Fe with a lot of indigenous people working with their hands or with however we're working, and we're all coming in to the similar perspectives and themes, but from different angles, it feels like. And it's wonderful. It's wonderful.
It is, and it's really exciting to see. And that you mentioned the young weavers, and there's some young weavers doing like killer,
and some of
incredible work.
Some of your lightning patterns and things, they remind me of like powwow shawls. Mm-hmm. It's very organic and indigenous, the designs that you're creating. And I think to create something that's unique, it really does sort of emerge in a way that, like, I keep going back to the word that you use, spiritual, but I sometimes think that artwork is created from being nervous. I really do. I mean, if I'm not feeling nervous, and if I'm not feeling like I have to kind of fumble around with something because I'm not sure how to resolve it, I'm not creating. And I get very unhappy when I'm not creating something. It's like a way of worrying the chaos into an order. You know, if you think about prehistoric times all over the world, everybody had stories about constellations. They were very different, but it was essentially a way of trying to flatten the three-dimensional enormity of the universe that is chaotic into something two-dimensional that we could control and kind of contain. And I think artists, a lot of times, we're kind of dealing with some dis-ease in ourselves that drives us to the page or to the art that we create, because we're seeking order in a way that without it we would be very, very uncomfortable.
Yes.
Perhaps.
Someone sent me an article the other day about how with knitting and crochet and other kind of yarn crafts, serotonin is released. There's been a study, and I'm like, yeah, welcome to my life. Sometimes, I mean, there's a lot of thought that goes into a lot of the work, but then from one angle, I can look at my life as like one continuous self-soothe of making things, because...
And then you have a beautiful thing.
Well, there's so much pleasure and joy. I mean, I really relate to the pleasure activism principles because art making to me, occasionally is excruciating. The work, the business, and the, survival parts are hard, but the making and the results, there's so much joy. Yeah, it's so much pleasure. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think it was very perfect that you kind of started talking about your work with each other, because I don't have a pointed question so much as like I would love to hear you both. This is more like an invitation, I guess. When I was watching your video and listening to you speak, Liz, and also when I was listening to you speak, Deborah, I felt like there was so much affinity going on. Like you both talked about being in awe of the other craft or being jealous of the other craft so far. But it seemed to me that there was so much affinity between something like a move towards realism or towards like more overt symbols and pictures, and a move towards nonfiction.
And evolution in both of our works at some point. Yeah.
So I was just, I don't know, I really just would love to hear you speak about if there's affinities there for you or what you see, thinking about moving throughout your journeys as artists.
I'm thinking of what you said about the last exhibit that you had, kind of surprising you. That it was, what did you say?
Nothing was deconstructed.
Yeah,
it's
pictorial.
very pictorial.
That was not a conscious change
No.
on your part. Yeah.
No.
It just was an evolution of...
Yeah, last summer I did a residency in Italy for 6 weeks. That was a real dream. I was in a semi-rural place in Umbria, and I was very close to the sky, like up high on a hill, and I spent several weeks drawing and painting because that's what I do to generate imagery that later I select the strongest ones and put them into textiles. So I was with this, there were storms, like frequently. There was a lot of environmental stuff going on, and I went on long walks. So it's, I mean, P-Town is like that for me. Like I come here partly to like immerse myself in this exquisite landscape, as so many of us do. It's essential for me to have many months of the year where I am immersed in some kind of nature landscape, so because it really feeds the work.
I'm the same way. I was in Umbria this summer, actually. Yeah, I need the outdoors. I was in Gubbio. Where were you? And Spoleto.
Civitella.
Yeah.
I'll later talk about it.
So, what was I going to say? Oh, the outdoors and being alone are very important to me. But in terms of like a pictorial quality or something that is not deconstructed, I think when I first started writing, I wanted to write essays that were very dense and jumped around a lot in time and included a lot of my personality, like I told you. And I think part of it was because I wanted to convince people that I was intellectual, because I wanted it to. And when I started to think that 50% of any kind of art is like the interpretation or the receipt by the person who's reading it or whatever, I don't know, I started becoming frustrated with creating stained glass, which was really beautiful and very nice, but I started to ask myself, why am I afraid of doing something that is more Windexed and that is more kind of set in a moment and just stays there? And it's like I said in my talk, I think ultimately I wanted to avoid being that person again because I have so many selves inside of myself. It was hard to just rest in it. But ultimately, I think that I created more lasting by staying there. There was plenty to say. There was plenty clear thought. There was plenty of there was a lot of contradiction to deal with, even if I stayed in that. Remember what I said about Lopate? He's from Brooklyn, and he had two Jewish. In a way, I allowed myself to kind of simplify back down to something,
and I was afraid that there wouldn't be enough there. And there was so much there in terms of indigenous philosophy, governmental policies, hidden histories, a lot of things that I could weave into the personal narrative because they had touched my family, the making of the atomic bomb, my grandma's sinus cancer, that was a very odd form she saw when they tested it by Laguna. Like, there was a lot there. And if I had been insisting on more of a stained glass, the history wouldn't have come through. It was what it was. Came out to be.
Thank you. I have a question for each of you, but unlike you, I haven't been able to synthesize them into one thing. So for Deborah, I was interested in, you had this beautiful phrase about the sort of the writer's voice being the person who's at the typewriter, at the computer. And I was curious what you do, or if you are able to suspend that voice if you're trying to write about childhood. Like, I'm often really aware that when we recount our childhoods, the frame of our adultness is just so pervasive. And I was curious
that's good.
How you handle that.
You want the frame of adulthood to be a perspective in the childhood narrative, always. I mean, I would never stick with a voice on the page. It would be very hard to stick with a 7-year-old's voice on the page for 300 pages. You know what I mean? I think when you want to write close to the body, one thing you can do to get the visceral details is to write in the present tense, just for a little while. You walk in the room, what's happening, you get all those details. But you ultimately have to translate it into the past tense to get the introspective, reflective voice that you have to have as a writer of adult literature, right? I didn't mean to imply that the book that I ended up writing was written so close to a child's voice that there was no adult perspective. The interesting thing that I didn't realize when I first started out is that sort of even if you're sticking with a time period, you're filtering through the writing all of the philosophies and wisdom that you have today. That to physically jump out of the narrative and put yourself in Umbria, in Gubbio or somewhere, do you know what I mean, is not necessary. It's actually there. And it suddenly occurred to me that I could write more than one book, which in the desperation of the early writing, you're like, I want to pack everything in, you know what I mean? And so it's really, I guess, I've heard so many people talk about writing the multitudinous self, writing the self that is all over the place. And I was such an eager student that I didn't realize that I was being incredibly digressive and unfriendly to my reader. And so I wanted to counter that today a little bit to say, what are the aspects of yourself that you run from? As soon as you start writing, you're jumping out of time to somewhere else as a means of maybe coddling yourself, making yourself feel better, because you don't want to look at it that clearly. And I'm not saying that that's what any of you are doing. That's what I was doing. And so for me, it was an incredibly rich experience to allow myself to be that kid. You know, before I think I was like, I don't have to give them any street cred. Like, they're trying to see if I really grew up on the reservation. They're trying to see who my family's, you know what I mean? And I was very defensive. And then when I let all the defenses fall and I didn't have any more worries, what I found was rich tribal history, rich tribal philosophies, rich governmental histories, like I said. So don't be afraid that your full voice isn't there. I was mostly talking about where is your setting, what are you developing? And it applies, I think, to fiction writers as well. But people stick with their fiction characters a little more closely. They don't have the same sort of fears and tensions that they have over a persona that is a creative nonfiction persona.
Right. And then Liz, my question for you, you mentioned several times, and Deborah picked up on it, the word spiritual and connecting your work to maybe some of the shifts in your work to whether your spiritual practice is developing or you're just at a point where you're ready to be disclosive about it. And I wondered if, I mean, in my mind, I made this leap between then when you said, I have to do this handwork every day, and that work is not drawn out, and that work is a little more experimental and improvisational. is the spiritual part of the practice linked up in the handwork, or is it in the drawing, or what are the, not to be too punny about it, but what are the threads that tie together the spiritual work and what you're ultimately making at the end of the day?
Yeah, thanks, Helen. So it's a good question. It makes me think, which is important. Spirituality. I feel like my whole life, my art making has been my spirituality. Like that is what I've gone to as. Like I grew up without any kind of organized religion. I was constantly frustrated by not having anything I could hold on to in times of crisis. My family life was chaotic and very sad, and there was nothing there for me to grab onto that gave me hope or like a belief outside myself that I grew up thinking that I had to solve the problems. And it's taken years of, doing all kinds of work to understand and to find things outside myself. And art making has always been a grounding place for me to explore, my own cosmology, my own universe, my own fascinations or obsessions. And so I think as the years have gone on and I've gotten more, interested in witchcraft and esoterica, and I discovered at some point not too many years ago the Theosophists. I saw a show in Turin in Italy that was about color, and the show started with the work from that book, Thought Forms. And so thought forms are kind of bundled together with the Hilma af Klint, her universe, and the people doing kind of spirit work. And through that spirit work comes abstract art. And that resonated, like when I read Thought Forms, which came in the 1900s, it was a Victorian era book, but that idea of thoughts and feelings becoming image, and that as a spiritual practice, that I felt like, oh, that's what I do, and then so that's one aspect of it that has to do with imagery, but then also in the weaving, in the stitching, in the repetitive making that textile work often is when you're doing it by hand. And this, you can look at like centuries of people making and the trance-inducing power of that kind of work, or the imagery that is in repetition, like that, patterns and like the Islamic patterns. I mean, there's so many examples over time. So I would say that kind of trance-inducing work was something that also came on really early as like a part of my spiritual life, like a way, like rather than sitting still and meditating, which I've always had trouble doing, I started to see it as an active meditation. And then the improvisational drawing, somehow that like connection to chance and every moment being the moment. Like, this is the moment, now you're doing this. And, when I was a teen, I got really into Zen Buddhism, and, I was a real seeker, like looking around, paganism, like, oh my God, this is it. Like learning these spiritualities that really resonated for me. And they were tied to nature, always. And that kind of work, handwork that makes you be in the complete present. Like drawing is very much that. Drawing is one of the hardest things because you really have to be in the moment. Like if you're drawing from observation, there's like everything falls away. And we could say that about playing tennis, but so these for me are my own spiritual journey and my spiritual life.
I love all
Does
of
that make sense?
Yeah, oh yeah. I mean, immersive writing is the same thing. Or I mean, when I took painting when I was younger, like, you know, the time that just suddenly passes when you're really observing and watching something or engaging in a repetitive act is really very, very powerful. It makes me think that I saw Gabrielle Seville from Cal Arts. She came out to our campus and gave a talk, and we talked a lot about ritual in the act of creating and what rituals you bring to your desk or to your art studio. What do you do before you engage with what it is that you're creating? And I find that really interesting, the idea of developing a ritual, thinking about how you're connecting with your ancestors, if that's the way you do it. Or I knew a guy in Iowa who lived in New York, and he would go sit on the corner and watch license plates until he saw a certain combination of letters. And then he would be like, bingo, go inside. And, you know, I don't know, you go in the closet and listen to heavy metal in the dark for a little while, and then you come out. Toni Morrison lit a candle. You know what I mean? It's like the idea of leaving the realm of financial worry and the business side of things and entering into a space that is trance-inducing.
Yeah, I mean, it's easy for me to say the closest I get to God is when I'm in the art flow. That's it. Or swimming. Okay, that's good too. But there in the show that's happening next summer at the RISD Museum, we are using in one room the thought forms as a kind of guiding principle in these different categories. And one of the categories is devotional, or devotion. And the curator I'm working with really sees the needlepoint work as that kind of work, like a devotional. So that's something like that resonates for me, that kind of act and the presence that it requires. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Deborah, when you said, my dad said my sister called him, I was like on the edge of my seat because I wanted to know, what did your sister call about and what was your dad's reaction? Because my thought is, you as the artist owns the outcome of your art. Yeah. But for anybody that was part of the experience, what do they own? Yeah. Right? They own a perspective. Do they own an opinion? Yeah. Like, would you ever want to have a conversation with your sister in that instance to say, what is your perspective versus what my perspective was? Yeah. Like, that can be dangerous. You talked about being uncomfortable, right? If she said, that isn't what happened at all, this is what happened, you know.
I think it was more the portrayal of her as a Republican, which is absolutely true to this day. That she's kind of a bigwig in Arizona tribal politics. In fact, she made the University of Arizona's Poetry Center do this big book launch. Our entire tribe came out, like council members and culture bearers and everything, because my sister snapped her fingers and ran everybody around. So she's very bossy and she's very strong-willed. And I think when she saw that I outed her as sort of her husband's like a Trump supporter, I mean, it's bad. I think that she was embarrassed. And so when she called my dad and basically for me, it's like, okay, my dad's 83 years old. He and my mom, neither of them got high school educations. My mom's one of 15 kids. My dad's one of 10 kids. They both went back and got their GEDs. My dad took his first college course at 83 with Tanaotham Community College. He just took Apache history. He takes one class a semester online. So he knows all about Apache history now. But the thing is that when he tells somebody, he's like, she got it right, and everything kind of gets quiet. I don't think I would go dig it up with my sister because you don't know what's going to happen if you do. You know what I mean? My family is a wild, the beginning of that movie Up, where the guy's family is really quiet with just a few relatives. That's like my husband. His dad's an only child, really buttoned up Milan people. And then there's my family with the guns, pow, pow, pow. Like, crazy people. My sister would, I don't put it past her to actually punch me in the eye. So I'm just kind of tiptoeing around it. And hopefully we win the election.
Yes.
Thank you, guys.
Yes.
Great place to stop. Big round of applause for Liz Collins and Deborah Taffa. Remember, they'll both be signing books at the back, so be sure to get yours and come back tomorrow. We have another great event with poets Nicole Seeley, Chen, and photographer David Hilliard is over here. Come back tomorrow night. Thank you. Have a great night.